Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again this evening. This evening we're going to look at a large problem for all of the studies of the humanities, all fields: history, literature, archaeology, and in fact the whole of the human past. It's a big order, but in effect we're needing to look at the ways in which we can cope with both preservation and access to the past. Preservation questions are paramount now these days because some of the source materials for studying the past are so fragile and weak that the more access that's afforded to them, the more they can deteriorate and in fact disappear. So access versus preservation has been a tension within libraries, rare book communities, rare map collections, museums. How can they afford access to the public and to the group of scholars wanting to work and further the scholarship on the materials, and at the same time preserve the materials? There's been that kind of tension until recently. And what we're going to argue today is that tension is largely resolved because of the new kinds of technology available. So we're looking at preservation and access, both and, as it were, rare and valuable historical documents in the age of iTech. Not high-tech so much as iTech. iTech is the realm of iPhones and iPads and interconnectivity on a global scale at this point. Every high school student knows what an iPhone is, and many of them even have iPads. And it's in many cases their main way of communicating with the world. So, if we're going to spend any time looking at what's happening to the humanities, we ought to look at this question of preservation and access through the lens of iTech. As it turns out, iTech is going to help us both preserve and extend access to classical and every kind of humanities discipline that's become discoverable since the classics. We can ask, for example, what do we know about the great poets and thinkers of the classical world? And sadly, we don't really know much. We don't have biographies, we don't have extensive autobiographies, and we don't have a great deal to go on even in their own written works because not many of them survive. Only a fraction of their thoughts exist in a very fragmented record from the past. So, in all honesty, we have to say that even about the most identifiable characters, we don't know very much. A lot of it's pieced together from fragments all over the world, certainly all over Europe, and then contextualized by archaeologists and historians. The person who's looked into this at great length is a fellow named Greg over at Tufts University. Greg Crane has looked at rare records and how to preserve them, in some sense, constitute a library of these rare records in the first instance, and then figure out ways to access them and assess them critically, as a scholar would. And he's done both of these things in a remarkable way, assembling a team, an international team, both sides of the Atlantic, with scholars from Germany and Italy and elsewhere. But we ought to listen to how he describes it. It's a pretty extraordinary effort and achievement.
For me, my job as a humanist is to serve the intellectual life of society. That's my number one job. If you start with that as a premise, and you look at the tools at your disposal, and you say, well, now I have these digital tools, for me that's the driving force. It's about the humanities pure and simple. My interest is in trying to understand the entirety of the ancient world from the perspective of a specialist in language.
Now, that's pretty broad and ambitious. My interest is to understand the entirety of the ancient world, but he adds, through the perspective of someone interested in language. And he is interested in language in a very deep way. But he acknowledges that that's only a piece of it, right? As you'd have to acknowledge. He's not an archaeologist. He's worked as an extraordinarily deliberate and focused scholar on the literature, the available literature, the remaining literature. And he's figured out that one of the first things you've got to do is basically constitute your own library of this material. And that's what he's done at Tufts University. Over in Eaton Hall at Tufts University, he's amassed and created an extraordinary project. Take a look.
So I contribute a piece to a larger understanding that depends as well upon the archaeological and general material record.
The great poets and thinkers of the ancient world are the subject of Gregory Crane's research, but he applies a unique approach. A classicist by training, he develops digital data processing methods to gain a deeper understanding of classical texts. The Department of Computer Science at Tufts University in Medford, Boston. This is where the pioneer of the digital humanities works on automatic text recognition and text mining processes. The key to it all was a project Crane and his team launched in 1985, the digitization of all known classical texts, a veritable task of Hercules.
What we needed first was a library. And so this was the sort of the mindset that ultimately turned into what we call the Perseus Digital Library.
Okay, there you get it. What we needed first was a library. So what they did was create a library of all known texts, digitized, and made available to an international community. Extraordinary. Let's pick up again and see how he describes it.
Classical texts, a veritable task of Hercules.
What we needed first was a library. And so this was the sort of the mindset that ultimately turned into what we call the Perseus Digital Library. The idea that you wanted to organize the information in a new way first. And so I saw this funding opportunity as a way for us to get support to build a sort of comprehensive library, one that covered every aspect and every data type about the ancient world in one interconnected space.
Today, Perseus Digital Library is a vast open-source online library for ancient texts, providing exceptional opportunities for text analysis and translation into many languages.
Okay, a vast international library of all known texts relating or coming straight from the ancient world, providing people with the capacity then to bring analytical tools to these texts. And he's developed ever since the analytical tools that can be brought to bear on this. So take a look. It's really quite extraordinary when you see the implications of what he's done. Take, for example, the comparative translations that are available now through this technology that he and his team have developed internationally.
We were able to build a reading environment where you could have an English translation, you could have a Greek text, you could point at a word, say, what is this word, what word is this from, and you could go to the dictionary and read the dictionary entry. And this automated a very slow and tedious loop for reading.
Crane is constantly working on new software programs. A tool for morphological analysis is just one of his innovative developments. Ancient Greek poses huge challenges to automatic reading because it contains too many ambiguities in meaning or variations of endings. Crane and his team are discussing new software that translates all the sentences in a text into syntax trees, elucidating the priority of the words and how they refer to one another.
By building up these databases, these tree banks, we create now a queryable knowledge base upon which we can rebuild and re-examine what we thought we knew about this language. It's like building a genome or a sky survey for ancient languages. It is a completely new foundation, and we can become much more precise.
Much more precise, and not only they can become much more precise, but a whole group now of international scholars that can have access to these rare and non-replicable ancient texts through high-resolution digitization. Now they get access to it in ways that can filter down not just to the experts, to their students and to the broader public. Take a look. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, the technology that's been developed for it. And it's applicable well beyond the ancient world. Latin was used for much of the early period after BCE, before the Common Era came to an end, and when the Common Era started, Latin was the means of communication, and there are many manuscripts in Latin that have never been translated until now. Why? Well, because it hasn't been easy to get access to them or make sense of them.
Innumerable Latin scripts written after 500 AD are languishing in the archives, untranslated. But not all students are able to study the original manuscripts. This is another case where software can help out.
Yeah, to say that not all students can get access to the original manuscripts is a bit of an understatement. In fact, very few students can get access to them. Very few students can get the research money to take the travel necessary to go to the European libraries in which they exist, and then get permission to get access to them and work on them diligently for months at a time. Yeah, very few students can do that. But the new technology and the software that's been developed to work with these manuscripts has changed that game altogether.
Students can enlarge digital pages at will, capture the original wording, and fill in the missing parts of words until they can complete their own translations, a completely novel form of active involvement.
We have an infinite amount of material for all practical purposes where our students can contribute. And so it is a new world in the best possible sense, one where there are no moral conflicts about people already being here. It is an empty space that we need to fill.
An empty space that we need to fill, in fact, students need to fill it now, with layer upon layer of new translations, retranslations, reconsideration within the context of a larger corpus of material and the like. Well, Greg Crane convened and conducted an important conference just this week, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was entitled Digital Editions in Practice. So not only has he worked out the theory, but he actually spent 2 days here on Friday and Saturday looking at the practice of doing this around the world. And it was really quite an amazing conference. People like Tom Kuntges gave a fantastic paper on corpus building and the CTS sites framework. Well, it sounds a little abstract at the beginning, but corpus building is building the library. You have to build the library, but then you've got to refer to it, just as you would in card catalogs, with a standard card catalog entry form, as it were. That's the corresponding concept. The CTS site framework is in fact a framework that's now being developed internationally, largely as a result of the work being done at Leipzig and here at Tufts University to pioneer this, to develop standards, CTS standards, for exchanging data about particular documents, what might be called the metadata about a document. So he was talking about building a corpus building, and the CTS site framework. He emphasized to the people who came to the conference that he tells his students the whole point about information that you access in these scarce documents is that you want to make it available. And he gets his students to write again and again, I will make information usable. I will make information usable. I will make information usable. Gets them to write it again and again until they get the point about scholarship. Scholarship is not just to develop new forms of expertise among experts. It's to make information usable to a wider public. In part, this is part of the preservation effort, because the more people that know about the original document, the more secure it is in some sense. Libraries are always subject to vicissitudes, to fires and the like. In fact, we saw this last year. The burning of the big museum in Brazil was a tragedy for all of humankind. The loss of many irreplicable source materials about the discovery of the New World. And the floods not too long ago, actually a few generations ago, but in Florence, that washed away libraries of material and had to be restored over decades ever since. That kind of tragedy occurs with greater frequency than anyone wants to admit. We also heard paper from people like Mark Patton from Johns Hopkins University, a librarian, specialist librarian there working in the Sheridan libraries, on IIIF in theory and practice at Johns Hopkins University. You might ask, because it's not frequently known on the street, what is IIIF? Well, he explained at great length and great clarity the International Image Interoperability Framework. Well, if you're developing standards to exchange metadata, that is, say, card catalog data about documents, that'll work the same in every library you exchange them with, you want to do the same for images, pictures, anything you can capture, in effect. And that's what the IIIF is. It's an international image interoperability framework, a way of describing pictures to one another across all national traditions, across all academic boundaries and disciplinary boundaries, and so you can exchange things on a global basis. Now, as Greg Crane himself emphasizes, he says, I contribute a piece that depends upon a larger archaeological and material record. Let's hear it again.
My interest is in trying to understand the entirety of the ancient world from the perspective of a specialist in language. So I contribute a piece to a larger understanding that depends as well upon the archaeological and general material record.
Okay, he's well aware he contributes a piece, and there are other pieces. But we should ask what other pieces can now be explored with these new technologies in the digital humanities in general. Not just within the classics and literature, but with anything that's happened since the classical world, since Rome and Greece, and well beyond literature, in archaeology, in material culture, as he points out, in anything that has been recorded and can now be discovered through archaeological means. That's the real realm of the digital humanities, not just the digitization of ancient Greek and Roman texts, a very important and trailblazing beginning to the digital humanities, but not the full extent of it. We got a sense of this in another paper presented called Pelagios, Open-Linked Geodata. Now, open-linked software, open-linked efforts to exchange data is a very powerful new way of humanities trying to link things from one institution to another and one scholar to another. But in effect, when you start doing it not just to the text, not just to the images, but to something as universal as latitude and longitude, geological data, georeferenced data, map data, then you have even more a powerful way to look at things. In fact, you can catalog all of human activity on two axes, basically a day, hour, and minute axis, that is a time axis, and a place axis, which can be located in latitude and longitude. Those are the two most powerful indexing criteria for any human activity. A range of dates and a range of spatial relationships, latitude and longitude. You can locate any human activity within that. And this new kind of framework, the Pelagios software that's been developed, allows you to do that kind of linking. So we can begin to ask ourselves how this might be of use more generally than beyond the realm of the classics where it was developed. Very useful there, and very useful well beyond there, which the rest of the humanities world is beginning to discover. There are some other sets of rare and valuable documents that can now be shared and examined in great detail, including things like maps, stones, plants, and what became the subject of an exhibit at Harvard this last week on agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic trade. The Atlantic trade is the Atlantic slave trade, but has a great deal of trace material left behind, including things written in stone, as it were, huge castles left on the coast of Africa, new plant communities that were introduced as a result of the slave trade, and an entirely new structure of the economy. So we know that there are historically important works that are too fragile to permit frequent handling. You can't just hand this around the seminar room and expect it to be in one piece by the time it gets to the other end of the room. It's too fragile. But what can you do? Now with digital technology, we can enable high-resolution access to these documents and what's inside these documents. Books can be opened in an entirely new way. Not by hand, they have to be opened by hand in the first instance, but they can be opened now digitally once they've been captured digitally. So something like this, a travelogue book, can be opened up and the maps can be unfolded, the maps can be digitized, and once digitized, they can be analyzed, exchanged, just as the ancient Latin texts were analyzed and digitized by graduate students, undergraduates, anybody who wants to and has bothered to learn Latin in this case, but in the case of texts in French and English and Dutch and German, other texts are now accessible. As with the rare Latin texts, these more recent rare works can be made accessible to whole new communities of scholars, not in any one country, but in fact around the world. When you look at some of these texts in detail, you learn a great deal. In fact, some of the things you learn are really quite extraordinary. If you looked at some of the details of those rare books that people only occasionally get access to, but now made generally available, you can start asking your questions about what do these different letters mean? What is A? What's E? What's F? What's H? What's D? What do all those things mean? Well, we see A is labeled here in the text annotation as fishing canoes of Mina, 500 or 600 at a time. That's a lot of fish. A lot of fish are being caught right in the wake or in the shadow of these big internationally voyaging sailing vessels from the various countries of Europe whose flags are displayed here. Why so much fish? Well, anybody who knows about salting cod and preserving fish for later consumption realizes that what's going on here is the building up of a protein store for transatlantic travel. Even on the same document, down in the lower part, there's an indication of a different kind of commerce going on. Under B, it's indicated, which you can see is here, Negro canoes carrying slaves on board of ships at Manfro. Manfro is the castle over here, and they're exporting these slaves up here, labeled as B, while people are paddling them out. And you can look in detail at these images to discover quite a few things. Remembering all the time, of course, that these are not photographs. They're images designed by engravers and artists, usually back in Europe, who have never been to Africa, but are usually describing scenes that they've heard tell of or read books about, or read manuscripts about from sea captains, travelers, and slave traders. So these are second-hand in some sense, but they're very interesting because these kinds of documents start to copy each other. To figure out who's copying whom, or whether they're both copying a common manuscript source, is a matter of some interest to historians. So if you take the analogy with what Greg Crane has worked out over at Tufts University for the detailed study of language in ancient texts, and you took out the Greek here and put in a map, say, and over on the right you had the French version of the map and the English version of the map over here, you could compare them point by point and see what the French include that the English leave out, or what they annotate with commentary on the side of the map, or how they represent a particular slave castle as opposed to how the English document does so. Now you can see that it's been an extraordinary breakthrough for the study of documents, a different rare kind of document, not an ancient Greek text, but using that same technology, a comparative study, close reading you might call it, of the visual information from the slave trade. Individual exhibits like the one that was held at Harvard last week could reach well beyond any one institution very quickly, right? Yes, it's important to have these exhibits at particular institutions where they have the access to the original materials, but very quickly you could put this original material up as in a usual exhibit and have a poster of it there and a descriptive catalog card next to it which people would see. Labels like this could be equipped with QR codes. The QR code is readable immediately by anything that can scan QR codes. You don't have to tell a high school student how to scan a QR code because it's kind of built into the iPhone that they've all become used to. They just point their iPhone at the QR code and what do they get? Well, they can get anything you wish to put behind it by way of contextual information, historical documents, a photographic reproduction of the original which they can study at 600 dots per inch, in much greater detail than they could see in the museum itself or on the walls of the department where it may be displayed. It basically empowers the viewer to go outside the gallery where the thing is first displayed and to look at the historical context as well as the historiographical information that's been written up in the scholarship by people studying it for decades. This is why galleries have begun to use QR codes, usually to direct you right to their catalog of the exhibit. Quite recently here the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum put on a fantastic exhibit of the Botticelli, and all you needed to do was to scan in the QR code, this one down here on the left. In fact, you can do it from your television. Once you pick this up on the TV, freeze this frame and scan in that picture of the QR code here, just that QR code with a QR reader. Any high school student can show you how to do it, and you'll get right to the description of their whole exhibit online, on the computer. Similarly, if one were studying Durer's woodcuts and representations of early European understandings of African animals, you could scan that in, and behind the QR code placed next to it here, you could place, any scholar could place, a complete history of that 1515 engraving, including why was it made in 1515 and what was Durer thinking when he made it. Well, as the Tuft Conference proved in the last 2 days, innovations in the digital humanities are just beginning. They've done an amazing job over the last 35 years of putting together a critical new approach. First, a critical new library of all the ancient texts that have been digitized, and then fantastic new software to make it available to groups of scholars from around the world and to those of us who aren't scholars of ancient Greek or Latin but want to learn about particular passages from Latin and Greek writers. They're developing a thing called the Scaife Viewer, which is still in the process of being worked on and honed to perfection. But when it becomes available, it's going to be an amazing new way of accessing documents. They've actually kept in mind that it's not just ancient Greek documents that the Scaife Viewer could work for. It's started out with dealing with the Iliad and Plato's Apology. These are the two things that are up there on a test basis, and you can certainly learn a lot just by looking at those. But when you think of what else it could be applied to, or what could be provided behind it, including all of the comparative study of translations of European literature ever since the classical period, when they are working on the Perseus Digital Library, the staggering implications of the Scaife Viewer are amazing, well beyond any particular session. In fact, Brill Scholarly Editions have figured this out. The big publisher of academic material in the North. And it's that collaboration that is going to drive this forward, a new kind of publication that is bringing humanities work to the fore in a new kind of global citizen science alliance. An alliance that's vital because there is no planet B. We only have one Earth, and we only get one chance.